Charles Parton, it's 27th of March, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.
About 3 years ago, you wrote a very interesting paper, and it was titled Towards a UK Strategy and Policies for Relations with China. 3 years later, two prime ministers late, is there a policy formed as you recommended and you urged the government, or we're still on cruise control and just passing by and observing what's going to happen with China?
Well, it wasn't just me, actually, who called for it. I mean, if you look at in the April 2019, the Foreign Affairs Committee report on China, they too called for it. And here we are 4 years later, and still no strategy. If you talk to government officials and say, you haven't got a strategy and why not, they'll say, yes, we have. And you say, well, where is it and what is it? Not much point in having one if nobody knows what it is. And then they say, well, we have an approach. And you say, well, that's not a great deal of use. And if you look at the integrated review refresh, which is a quite appalling term, isn't it? I mean, refresh is not a noun, but never mind. It talked about, I think I counted them up, 24 different strategies that have either come out in the last couple of years or are about to come out, 9 that are about to being worked on. No mention of a China strategy. This is a difficult problem because it straddles just about every ministry, and it's a very sensitive problem in the sense that we know how the Chinese Communist Party reacts to statements of how governments want to act in their own interests and their own security and in pursuit of their own values and protections. So I'll turn this off. Sorry about that. I'll kill that.
We didn't hear it, Charlie. Don't worry about it.
Oh, I did. It was very loud.
Yeah. Charlie, is there a sense of ambiguity that we don't want to say our policy is, just keeping it hybrid? Is that a sense of, or it's just purely nothing is there?
No, I think the problems of being, I mean, there is a certain, I think, reluctance to be tied down, but also the problem has been that the bandwidth really hasn't been that sufficient because ministers have been occupied with many other serious problems like COVID, the National Health Service, questions of illegal immigration, you name it. And also ministers have changed far too frequently. So, it takes 6 months for a minister to come in, get his or her feet under the table, understand the problems, by which time, of course, they've been shuffled. So this has not been a distinguished feature of our governance in the last few years, any form of continuity. So a number of problems, but it's for sure, as you rightly point out, I mean, that's the point of your question, this is well overdue.
Yeah, right.
And it's very serious because, I mean, people, we need unity of approach towards China. China's very good at divide and rule. So that's not just unity within our government departments, but unity between our government and other governments, unity between our business, our academia, our think tanks, etc. And even important perhaps for China to know where we're going in our relations to avoid misunderstanding.
Sorry, interrupted you there, Charlie. I sense, and it's been written about this, quite a gear change between the Cameron and post-Cameron governments. Now, Brexit can be one factor, but beyond Brexit, why do you think there has been this apparent shift away from embracing China, as it appears, and to what end?
Yes, well, of course, I always call it the golden era, spelt with 3 R's rather than era. I mean, in many senses, it was it an aberration? Possibly, but it was a policy built, frankly, on ignorance. I think the main thing now is that people have begun to understand very much more clearly, eventually, what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is about, where it's going, and why its values and the direction of travel are inhospitable or inimical to our interests. So, a greater awareness has arisen. Sometimes it's a bit too strident. I mean, we have to get on with China. We can't ignore it, for goodness sake. It's enormous and it's very important. So yeah, we've moved considerably by then. I don't think we've we see it, the generality, the government, the people of UK, business, etc., see it quite as clearly as they need to see it in terms of what its intentions are, which I'm afraid are not healthy for us. But we're moving, and that requires us to have different policies, different strategies, and that takes time. But it's taken too much time.
So we are looking down the barrel of election the next, I don't know, 18, 24 months, Charlie. And one sees the divisions within the Conservative governing party in Parliament when China comes up and so on. I don't get a sense that the opposition parties have worked out, let's not call it strategy, an approach that would be appropriate for Britain and its place in the world. Do you see any, either collective or amongst the leading opposition parties, a refreshed thinking about a China strategy? Or, as Ali said, are we just grappling in the dark?
Well, I think it's. I think they're very keen to understand what's going on and to come up with a coherent policy. Of course, it's they too have many things on their minds. So have they formed a coherent policy yet? Probably not. But they're certainly working on it. Of course, it's much easier in one sense in opposition to be a little bit more coherent, because you don't actually have to implement that policy. On the other hand, you don't either have all the tools, the information, the ability to say to government departments, tell me about this, produce for me options which we can consider. So if Labour wins the next election, or if there's a coalition government, whatever, then I think there will be a period when they have to as one hopes, quickly gird their loins and start laying down some policies. That process has already started in their minds, but clearly, it won't happen until after the election.
Charlie,
what would you advise them to do, Charlie, before Ali comes in?
Well, I have in this sense, and I'm trying desperately to rack my brains to remember all the things that I've said that the UK government should do, because I don't think it matters which government of which complexion is in power. But very obviously, the first one is to take the matter very seriously and to put in, I'm afraid, more resources. Everyone always calls for more resources to understand what is going on. I mean, that's the absolute basis of it. Secondly, I think that a much more joined up approach is necessary. I mean, if you look at what Kevin Rudd, for instance, did when he came to power in Australia, one of the earliest things he did was to form a very high level committee at the ministerial level, where ministers were not just enjoined, but I think made to play a very active part. And it was all about China policy, and so they were held responsible, and they therefore got their departments working. And politics is never ideal, but I think that they had a much more coherent view on it. So that would, I think, be the second thing to do, just to start with. And again, sort of allied to that, or helping with that, would be a much more systematic outreach to those elements in the UK who do spend their time looking at China and have different things to say about it, and perhaps able to shed some enlightenment. So that would be a start, but only a start.
Isn't there not a challenge for UK? And I know that, this whole dialogue about Five Eyes, sometimes I think the Five Eyes need an eye test, because they're looking at the world in a sense, it's a bit of a myopism, because, the reality is when you add Australia, Europe, United States, and Japan, you come to 1.2, 1.3 billion people. The other 6.5 or 6 point whatever are seeing things through a different kaleidoscope of the needs of development. Do you think UK could have been much more smarter towards this China policy? As you said rightly in your interview as well with Center for International Strategic Studies, that we shouldn't be too in decoupling and divergence. Was there not a role for UK, given its historical insights through relationships with China, Hong Kong, and the rest of it, to be the center of dialogue and shaping this movement forward, rather than just latching on US policy and finding itself in contradiction with the rest of the world?
Well, a couple of things there. I mean, of course, to be able to do that sort of leadership role in policy requires you actually to have a strategy. I think that was the point that I made in the paper. Secondly, I don't think we should get too distracted by Five Eyes. I mean, Five Eyes is an intelligence alliance. It's not a a bloc like as in the Cold War or whatever. It's not like NATO, etc. And therefore we should be looking, as you rightly intimate, at a much broader alliance of those that share our values and our systems, and we have very deep economic links with, etc., etc. But you also make a very good point that the way we look at the world here in Europe, Japan, Korea, you might say, Australia, etc., America, may not be the way that many look at it in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, Asia, etc., where there are different imperatives, including, most obviously, the need to better their own lives, to have development. So, some of which China supplies through its I hate to use the word Belt and Road Initiative, because the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't exist. It's a very fine slogan, very good, and you have to congratulate them on it. But what's really exists is Chinese globalization, and we should concentrate much more on the specific projects and movements that China indulges in, rather than go along with their sloganizing. But that's just a personal beef. So I talk about Chinese globalization rather than BRI, although it's horribly difficult not to slip into that jargon, which shows how good it is, of course, as a slogan. So yeah, I mean, again, do we always follow America? Well, yes, in many ways we do, because we share so many attributes with them, not just language, but I mean in terms of values and security, of course, but also economic interests. I mean, our investments there and theirs in us are enormous. So inevitably we do that. But yes, you're right. I mean, as I said in that early paper, and I continue to say, we don't want to be too desperate about the D word. D, what does it stand for? Decoupling, divergence, de-risking, you name it. It's not like against the Soviet Union, as it were, where we didn't cooperate, we didn't really trade, we didn't invest, we didn't do science and technology. We're deeply involved with China in many, many different ways. And of course, since the old Cold War, climate change has loomed very large as well, and including pandemics, etc. So, it's foolish, I think, to be too, what's the right word? Strident, aggressive, absolute on decoupling. It's just not going to happen anyway, and we must minimize it. But all that said, we have to realize where China is coming from, what it's trying to achieve, how it's trying to achieve it, and not leave ourselves vulnerable. And so just about every time I chat with people or write something, I always quote the American poet Robert Frost: "Good fences make good neighbors." You've got to make those fences. You've got to lay down the boundaries, just as China does, and say, those areas, they're out of bounds, China, just as they're out of bounds to us in China. But beyond that, yes, we're open for business, and we've got to work together. It's easier to say, of course, than to do in practice.
Charlie, Ali talked about the Five Eyes. I'm going to talk about the submarines. The AUKUS initiative. It was kind of sprung upon the British public by a prime minister who didn't seem to have much of a foreign policy strategy at the time either. But it seems to be acquiring its own momentum as we go forward, and particularly as Americans are obviously keen, and the new Australian government is also keen on this. From a British perspective, beyond building submarines and so on, if you're looking at Britain's kind of grand strategy, what is in it for UK PLC, and how will it affect Britain's relations with Indo-Pacific, for want of a better term?
Well, of course, AUKUS starts with submarines, but I don't think that's by any means where it's going to end.
Right.
And nor is it intended to do so. I think there's a lot more cooperation going on that. It's in tune with the so-called tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. I mean, that is an increasingly important area. Well, one can also say that in many ways, the impetus behind it was, of course, stimulated by or made by the Chinese Communist Party, which by what it was doing in that region, whether that's the South China Sea or the Indo-Pacific itself, has greatly worried an awful lot of countries, including Japan and others. I mean, look at Japan's increase in its defense budget and an increasing willingness to go beyond the constraints that were put on it after the Second World War. So it's an important area. It is about also upholding some of the. I mean, it's allied to the upholding of the values that we stick by. I mean, the law of the sea or whatever. But ultimately, you have to be able to back up your positions with deterrence as well. So yes, important, I think.
But the Australians had recognized it because they already had a pretty good deal going with France, as it happened, and it's the way in which, they if you like, the Anglo world upended that one and put in motion a very different thing, having gone some way by Australia and France towards meeting some of Australia's defense requirements. So, sitting in Beijing, you don't see much of a coherent Western structure in the Pacific, do you? You're seeing neighbors like Britain and France competing with each other for the Australian market, as it would seem from the Chinese. Does it come at the expense of the alliance, that France being shoved out rather rudely from the French perspective, and the Brits and the Americans coming in, saying something different to China about the Western strategy?
Well, there's two things about France and that. And one is the manner in which the deal was sort of announced and the way, in a sense, the French were moved out. And then there's the substance of it. I mean, let's start with the substance of it, that the French contract for the diesel submarines was way off course, really slow, not getting anywhere, but also, in a sense, overtaken, because that wouldn't really have left Australia, even if it was up to speed with the sort of defensive capability that they need, because diesel submarines have a far greater signature and are far more vulnerable than what they're going to get. As for the method, the style in which the decision was conveyed, both globally and to the French, I mean, very unfortunate. But again, these sorts of agreements are, until they're actually signed, they are secret. You don't go broadcasting them to anybody. Maybe because they won't come about, or they'll come back in certain ways. So, they are negotiated very quietly, and then you announce them. What was it? What done well and tactfully or whatever? No, but I don't think it was ever going to be welcomed by the French, because they were their contract came to an end.
So how do you see now Britain's role in taking AUKUS forward? Because we know that at least one of the submarines is going to be built in Britain. Obviously, that has all sorts of technological spin-offs and financial rewards coming into the UK. But what kind of security engagements are going to follow this, you think, once you begin to look at delivery, training, and deployment cycles?
Well, that's a little bit outside my area of expertise, because I spend my life looking at the Chinese Communist Party and not the undersides of submarines, or indeed the insides of submarines. But clearly this technology is not shared by the Americans. I mean, they shared it with the British some decades ago. They've now expanded that to Australia, which shows you, I think, the seriousness with which they take the threat from China. Let's be open about it. So benefits to the UK. Possibly we'll see what all those are, but certainly in the sense of greater coordination and cooperation on security against a very real threat. So I don't think these things are done just because it creates jobs or whatever. There are wider issues at stake.
Charlie, looking at the world and through the real politic, and I want to take the conversation in a few minutes to technology and the sphere of technology and the TikTok of the world and the rest of it. When countries, there's a school of thought that's saying, oh, we thought that if China gets into globalization and WTO, they start behaving like us and they will conform to our values. And then one would say at the same time, thanks God they didn't conform to our values, because if China wanted to have, an Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan, it would have been quite, substantive. So thanks God that they are not yet flexing their muscles in the military terms the way we have in the Western Hemisphere, at least in the past 50 years. But is there not a bifurcation? And I really like your wisdom when you talked about divergence and decoupling. If we push it too far, which you advise against in your paper and in your podcast, that we have this splinter of not just the internet, but financial system, the markets, the technologies. And I have raised this question with a few people who were not able to answer, but I think you can. Tomorrow morning, China says, you know what, we want to trade in renminbi and yuan and, forget about it. And the global South will find itself a little bit more interested as well. Can the United States say you cannot use my fiber optics under the Atlantic for transactions, even if they are not in US dollar? And if that is the case, what's going to happen and how China will react?
Well, that's a very complicated set of questions. And I think actually, although I do say that we should minimize the D word, whatever it is, in practice, of course, there is going to be a very wide divergence. You only have to look at technology and the increasingly narrow distinction between military usage and civilian usage. So let me just give you a very quick example. There's a university, Western University, been cooperating with the Chinese university on the salinity of seawater. Great, how salty it is, that you could say, well, that's environmental, but it isn't, because the way torpedoes move through water and the detectability of them and submarines, etc., is closely allied with the salinity of water. And the Chinese university that's cooperating is closely allied with the PLA Navy. This is a military attempt to get hold of information that develops the Chinese military. And the naivety of the foreign university is that it doesn't realize what's going on. It should. So you can see that, of course, there are civilian uses for salinity, understanding the salinity of water, but they're also military. And that is why I think we're going to see increasing divergence, actually, in practice, because of the technology, and that affects finance and many other things. But at least one hopes that trade and investment in basic commodities, one might say, basic products will not be subject to ideological barriers. But if I could just take you up on the yuan and the internationalization of the yuan. Sure, it's growing. It's growing from a very small base at a very slow pace, and it will not be able to become a reserve currency, or indeed a major currency. It's less than 2.5% of transactions at the moment. But two things would be required for it to be able to, in any way, to match or let alone threaten the dollar. One would be an opening. China would have to open the capital account. The moment it did that, of course, most Chinese would diversify their holdings out of yuan into something else, because they don't trust the Chinese government. And they don't trust the Chinese government, particularly as the yuan developed, not to be able to manipulate and see exactly what they're doing with their money. So they get it out, which would cause a massive drop in the value of the yuan, and possibly really crater the economy. So that's one thing. And the other thing that you have to do is you have to have a run a consistent trade deficit so that there are plenty of yuan for other countries to use. Well, that doesn't look as though it's happening either in a short term. So I think that's a little bit of a red herring, even though you know the yuan will be used as a between current countries almost in a form of barter, but I exaggerate. But that does mean that China remains, and Chinese companies for the foreseeable future remain very vulnerable to American financial sanctions.
Sorry, please.
No, I mean I just say so that will affect the way that China operates.
On the issue of divergence, particularly when it comes to technology, and President Biden is obviously taking action on that, and Europe is beginning to kind of get a bit more hard skin about some of their relationships with Chinese corporates as well. How will that damage both parties, Charlie? Because I suspect that it'll be one of mutual loss in place of mutual gain. I take your point that, you know, there are dual-use technologies in virtually everything we now use. You know, spyware gets into our phones as much as it used to get into systems of communications used by governments and so on. But technology is essential, like water, to our modern living. So divergence will have very dramatic impact on that. Is the objective to slow down China's progress, not to give it certain technologies, to keep it in check, not to let it use the technologies against Western societies? Is it, or is it just about putting this, as you said earlier, these clear fences between neighbors?
Well, you're absolutely right, of course, that increasing divergence will mean losses to both sides. I mean, we will be less off as a result. The answer to that would be yes, but what price do you put upon your security, your long-term economic prosperity, which ultimately actually comes almost to the same thing as security, your values, human rights, and indeed your data. So I mean, I think it is inevitable that however good the fences we are and have a wishing we are of cooperation, a very considerable degree of divergence will occur. Now, sorry, repeat the second part of your question to that was.
So how, you know, these different, why are we wanting to get out? What is the end game if we know that it's going to have implications for global economic exchanges? And also, what do we expect China to do? Do we expect China to then slow down its rate of progress, to find its own alternatives, or ultimately cement these harder boundaries between the West and China? And is that ultimately a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, start at the end. I'd say ultimately a good thing when you see what the threat is coming from China, because you know, China is very clear that it's in a struggle with free and open countries. It talks about hostile foreign powers at every single opportunity. You only have to read the speeches or the thoughts of Xi Jinping to see where he's coming from. And indeed, and its intent, declared intent, if you translate it into plain English in terms of 2049 and what they call the second centennial goal, is to be the #1 superpower and reduce America to #2, and to change the world's governance and values so better to suit its own interests, which what powers do, basically. And it is working towards that. And we shouldn't just think of divergence as an American phenomenon. I mean, you know, the Chinese are doing this themselves. The most obvious area is things like the internet, where it's deliberately cutting itself off. But it goes a lot wider than that. And you know, one of the big themes that Xi Jinping has been talking about in the last few years has been self-reliance. You have the Made in China 2025 project, the intent to produce its own and technologies and dominate those. You have the dual circulation policy, which is, put it in a very crude characterization, and domestic wherever we can, foreign if we really have to. So that's the way it's going, and I think that we need to be very cognizant of the threats or the danger that we put ourselves in if we allow China to do what it's trying to do, which is to obtain monopolies in certain crucial technologies. And certainly to attain the dominant position. I mean, they say that quite openly, but also to attain monopolies through subsidies and theft of technology and many other techniques, some fair, some foul. I would just give you two examples of that. Obviously, 5G communications and Huawei. If you can monopolize that, tremendous power given to you. We'll come back to that. But even more serious than that are cellular Internet of Things modules, which few people know what they are, and yet they are already throughout our industrial processes, logistics, security, defense, homes, you name it, and provide a very powerful weapon to whoever dominates that market. And China is pushing 3 companies, which most people won't even heard of. I mean, Quectel, is that a familiar household name? I don't think so. Fibercom, I can see you shaking your head. And China Mobile, which people have heard of, but only because of its mobile thing, not because it produces these modules. And the 3 threats there are very, very serious indeed. And I would characterize them as greater than the threat from 5G, which, as you know, in the UK, Europe, America, has been a massive topic for conversation in the last few years. The 3 threats are what? If you obtain a monopoly on that, and they're pushing that very hard, what happens? First of all, massive dependency of our countries on China. We don't like your policy, UK, on whatever it is, opposing us for the World Cup, holding the World Cup in whenever it is. And we just like to remind you that you're entirely dependent on us for these modules, upon which your economy and your whole way of life depends. That's a very dangerous dependency. Secondly, they are designed to send information in and out of whatever processes they're in. You then analyze that information, you then send things back in and improve the processes. That's the whole point of them. Now, if you're in a position, because you have a monopoly on those, to put in software whenever you like, and it's not very difficult, you can really mess things up. So you have a question of not just dependency, but at a time of hostility in the future, maybe 5, 10, 20 years, who knows? But these things are there a long time. You either stop things happening in your target country, stop all cars moving. It would not be difficult because they have cellular modules in. Bring the grid to a halt, stop electricity, or else you degrade processes, which would be a bit clever actually than just stopping them, because you wouldn't quite be sure what was going on. But you could, for instance, because all government entry to their buildings or alarms or heating systems have these systems in, these modules in, just send an instruction to prevent the doors in the Ministry of Defence opening. It just cause trouble, but you could do a lot worse too. So that's the danger. And then because so much data is egressing from these devices, that's the whole point of them. Taking all that data, collecting all that data, you then aggregate it and make some very important, powerful intelligence tools, military tools, economic tools. So that dependency we are sleeping through. When I go to talk to people in the government here or in Washington, and I say, cellular modules, you really need to think about these. They go, and you just look at behind their eyes, you know they don't know what you're talking about. Now, I have to be honest, a year ago, I didn't know what I was talking about until I started working with someone who knows the science far better than I do about these things, and realizing that, Huawei, that was a threat, but this is a much bigger one. And incidentally, they're getting together with Huawei, because it's all very well keeping Huawei out of your masts and your base stations in your system. Great, you've closed the front door. And then what happens? You leave the windows and the back door open, because Huawei produces, or is trying to produce with Quectel, the boxes which decode the signal in your home, your office, or your organization. So the data can just be gotten there. We need to wake up.
Charlie, it's amazing. But I want to first and foremost say I'm learning a lot. Thank you very much for that. Some of the terminologies in the back of my eyes as well were new for me too. But a couple of questions there, Charlie. And I want to read a quotation from Tufan Ergin Bilgic, which is the new CEO of Rolls-Royce. You had the head of government relations of Rolls-Royce in your famous paper, in which he says, every investment we make, we destroy value. We are on a burning platform, and continues to say we underperform every key competitor out there, number one. Number two, you look at HS2 from 30 billion to 110 billion. These are not things that the Chinese have done. Did we lose focus on our key areas of project management, engineering, manufacturing along the way, and becoming intoxicated only with services and finance? That is my first question. And because Anush has been naughty, I want to punch in another question there as well. And the second one is that there's so much going into war games historically between great powers. And many of these war games turn out to be absolutely waste of time. As an intellectual, as somebody who's looking at the world affairs, why don't we invest in peace games and thinking of how we can co-live for a change? I mean, if half of those resources for all of these war games of how we can hurt each other would be spent through universities, collaborations of how we can coexist together, wouldn't that be a new era with one R?
Well, it takes two to tango. And of course, this is that old philosophical game of the prisoner's dilemma. And how much you trust the Chinese Communist Party to join in a peace game. And, looking at its history, I think you'd be very unwise to do so. And that's always been the way in human nature, hasn't it? That actually you prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So you do have to keep your guard up, I'm afraid. It doesn't matter which era of history you look at, it has always been thus. So yes, by all means play peace games, and people do in a sense. I mean, the obverse of coin, or the reverse side of the war game coin, is you're actually trying to promote peace and prevent war. So you can call it a war game, but you could also call it, in a sense, a peace game. As for the wider question that the question you ask about the
about capabilities and about focus. I mean, HS2 ballooning from 30 billion to 110 billion. I hardly think part of that can be associated, to China. It's just like mismanagement of planning and project management, something that this country used to be, a contender around the world, or what the CEO of, Rolls-Royce says. So I feel like externalizing, you talked about dependency. I think there is a complacency as well in terms of where to focus, and I wanted you to weave into that, please.
And indeed, you could broaden that to our political system, because our democracies are not working nearly as well as they should or could. But these are enormous questions. I mean, why are we not as good as we were at project management or certain industrial skills? Is that because of our education systems? It's possibly, but also I think through our social attitudes, where we're very good at services, and we make a lot of money out of it too. But we've if you look at Germany, and where the emphasis is, and the glory is the wrong word, but reputation comes from being a very good engineer, for instance, then they are the world leaders in
We're talking about the Mittelstands, I think.
Well, but more broadly about the way society is structured, that you, as a German engineer, you get a lot of respect, and kids want to become. Whereas our kids don't look in that direction. Quite how you change that culture, I don't know. But two other things I think are important. I mean, one is that things are increasingly specialized, and I think that we're a middle-sized country. You cannot, like the US or China maybe, cover the whole waterfront. You simply don't have the resources and the depth. So we need to select those particular areas where we're good and put the resources in. The second thing I often wonder about, and it's not an original thought, is whether the old laissez-faire economic system, capitalist system, if you like, is any longer fit for purpose, or indeed is it fit for, not because it didn't work, but things have moved on, and in particular the challenge that China poses is a very different system, and we it's not just that we can't compete. I mean, we do compete, and we compete quite well, but it's fine if you everyone plays by the rules. But here we have a Chinese Communist Party that doesn't play by the rules, or plays by different. Sometimes it ignores the existing rules. Sometimes in new areas it makes up its own rules, which is in a sense fair enough. If there are no rules, you set the standards. That's a sensible thing to do. But it provides a real challenge for us, the way that it builds up its industrial champions, the way that it's prepared to subsidize to a degree that our governments aren't prepared to, in order to get a monopoly, in order to win the industry. And then once you've done that, of course, with a monopoly, you can set prices or make dependencies as you will. And a very obvious example of that is solar panels, where through years of subsidy and various other methods, some fair, some not, China has dominated the industry and made it very difficult for other nations to compete there. So, that's fine in the days when our system, as it were, ruled. But if you've got people who are playing outside the system, you're going to have to change your own.
You almost use the term industrial strategy. You certainly,
well, I'm happy to use it. No,
you certainly implied it, Charlie,
yeah.
and that to me that seems like where President Biden is trying to take the US, which is much more hardline and laissez-faire capitalism, as you know, than Britain maybe. But he is trying to instill a sense of a national mission back in the US grand strategy. And as you say, and Ali alluded to this, Germany seems to have that mission kind of in its DNA, and France is trying to do a similar thing. So, and I think the opposition parties here are talking about an industrial strategy. But if we are cutting some of the world off from ourselves, including the European Union in that argument, then what is that industrial strategy in your view? And beyond Rolls-Royce, who else is left to drive it? Because we've privatized so much of our infrastructure already that it's very difficult for the state to begin to orchestrate a strategy amongst the various operations of the state. So how can the country revive a non-service sector prosperity?
Well, you're right in your diagnosis, because the United States has put, I can't remember the exact sum, but towards industrial strategy. Europe's doing the same. The Germans also putting vast sums into certain industries. So yeah, I think we and we're putting tiny sums. So and I think our Conservative government has an intellectual and basic dislike for the words industrial strategy. I fear that it has to change because of the China challenge. So that is something that our new government, after the next election, will have to grasp, and one hopes grasp very quickly. And it will need to put some money where its mouth is, and it will have to decide, because we can't compete in all areas of technology, which ones we will. I mean, we're quite strong in some areas, sort of the pharmaceuticals and the biosciences, etc. So there are definitely areas where we are quite good. There will also be, I think, strategic areas where it would just be unwise to allow capabilities to evaporate, because they're very difficult to get back. But yes, at this stage, if you were to try to pin me down and to specifics, I would then plead, look, let's talk about the Chinese Communist Party, but British industrial strategy is way outside my normal areas of study.
A few years ago, if you remember, Charlie, Hong Kong Stock Exchange came out of the blue, lobbied and wanted to have a partnership with LSE, and LSE brushed them off. Now LSE is bleeding somehow with no IPOs of late from ARM and the rest of it, So in hindsight, from a China connoisseur and specialist, was that a oversight of not creating, at least being financially, intertwined as such to have a carry of interest between here and China for future financial markets, where those services that we so highly associate ourselves with as a sector? Do you think that was a mistake?
Well, again, I have to say this is way outside my area of expertise, in the sense
as a taxpayer, do you think that it was a mistake?
I still say it would be outside my area of expertise, and whether the LSE, the London Stock Exchange, should have got together with another partner is one question, and I'm simply not qualified to answer that. When it comes to Hong Kong and China, I think increasingly, first of all, we have to think of the two as the same. So secondly, is China the right partner for this sort of services? Without being an expert in financial services in any way, even when it comes to China, I would point to the way the Communist Party thinks and has thought about joint ventures in the manufacturing sector, which is, again, to sum up crudely, yes, come and have a joint venture, work with us, we'll learn how to do it, and once we've mastered it, we'll throw you out. And that is clearly what it would like to do with financial services. It doesn't really want, in the longest term, Hong Kong to be the center. It would much prefer Shanghai to be the center, but that's going to be impossible, I think, for as long as the yuan is not a fully convertible currency. But that would be the long-term aim. So, instinctively, I would say be very careful with whom you sup. Sometimes one needs a relatively long spoon. And the other thing that I did actually look into in some detail was a paper that I wrote called Empty Threats, Policy Making Amidst Chinese Pressure, because it seemed to me that far too often, whether it was business, government people, journalists, whatever, were saying, well, we can't do this because China will punish us. But actually, if you look around, and I looked at 6 sectors, I looked at exports, services, investment into our countries, tourism, students, and cooperation on climate change. And in all those areas, first of all, you don't suffer when you're in the diplomatic doghouse, whether you're Australia, UK in 2012, Korea, you name it. There have been plenty of countries that have fallen foul of the communist regime. And what has happened to their exports during that time? They've grown. I mean, the only time, as it happens, that UK exports in the last decade, pre-COVID anyway, fell was during the 2015-16 golden era. But that's not actually connected with politics, and that's my point. So all the other countries, their exports to China arose, including, Norway is a slight exception because its fish exports to China did plummet, but then its fish exports to Vietnam went through the roof, and to Hong Kong, and they were just going back into China that way. And of course, its global fish exports, because trade is fungible. So China might get it from somewhere else, but that means other markets Norway moves into. So its global exports rose. And then again, if you look in investment in the UK, Chinese investment, up to when the paper was written, it was creating or maintaining about 928 jobs a year, according to our Office of National Statistics. The stock of Chinese investment was 0.4% of our investment. And so it goes on. Again, if my memory serves me right, the amount of income the city earned through services from China was 0.04%. Now you can say, yeah, but in the future, what? Yes, but even so, we're starting from a very, very low base. So it continues. So I think let's not exaggerate the threat. If we've got a good product, if it's at a good price, and whether that's a service or an export, or in terms, translate out into terms of investment, then it goes ahead. There are cases where the Chinese will punish certain companies or certain sectors where either it's highly symbolic, makes a lot of publicity and propaganda, or it's not that important to them. And you look at, Korean supermarkets or Australian wine, but even Australian wine has recovered very well without being able to go into China in terms of its sales. So let's not exaggerate. Let's, as I say, build those fences and try to cooperate in a mature fashion with China, even though, if Xi Jinping will forgive me, I think sometimes the Chinese Communist Party behaves in a fairly childish fashion in its dealings with us.
Before we go behind those fences and have a drink, as you are suggesting, I wanted to ask you with two questions and wrap up today, and hopefully to bring you back to have a session on technology and a deep dive on technology at some point in 2023. If you were to leave our audience with two pieces of advice to the cinephobes and cinephiles, what would those two be?
Oof, two pieces of advice. Read
both sides, to cinephobes and cinephiles.
Well, I think the same advice would be to both, and that is read what the Chinese Communist Party says to itself, and it's not that difficult these days. I mean, the Chinese language, as Zhou Enlai once said, was the first level of code, but you can actually put stuff into some of these translation apps and get a very good sense of what's going on, and or else select a few commentators who do this for you and read what the Chinese Communist Party is saying. That will give you a far better understanding. What would the second piece of advice be? Well, I suppose if in a slogan, it would be, as they say at Waterloo Station, mind the gap between rhetoric and reality.
Right.
China puts a vast effort into propaganda, both domestically and abroad. It takes a little bit of experience to see between the two, but not always, I would say.
Very, very wise words indeed, Charlie, there. You've given us so many fascinating takeaways. Your discussion of technology, as Ali said, was for us groundbreaking. These are issues that I think we need to delve into much more deeply and actually raise general awareness of them in the ways that you have promoted. I think it's really important that we have for the first time looked more closely at the place of United Kingdom in the international system, but selectively, where it is in Indo-Pacific, where it is in relation to its allies, and so on. I think that is a conversation to be developed as we go towards the next general election, because you're right, countries do need to rethink their grand strategies, and UK is well nigh due for a broader discussion, conversation about itself and about its place in the emerging world order. Hopefully by then the war in Ukraine will have finished and there'll be opportunities as much as challenges to be looking forward to manage. And the third is, I'm really glad you mentioned Norway, because I am astounded by the way in which Norway has managed to move beyond being a rentier economy dependent on fossil fuels to becoming a major sustainable exporter of food products. Having visited some of these fishing industries of Norway, I was amazed how far their exports go, how sustainable, environmentally friendly to a large extent they are, and the research the Norwegians do into making sure that these products are now competing at the world level as much as their fossil fuel exports had done a decade ago. So I'm really pleased that you brought in Norway into our conversation, because it's the first time he's got an honorable mention. So I'm delighted, and I've vested interest in it because my eldest son is actually studying Scandinavian studies and learning Norwegian, because he's passionate about the culture and the history and the way in which they do business in Norway as well. So Charlie, I'm really grateful to you for the comments you've made and the insights that you brought to the table. And there are at least 3 other things that I want to discuss with you that I've noted already, in terms of grand strategy for Britain, in terms of where we go, is the Norway model sustainable for us, but also where is technology taking us in our global relationships. So really grateful to you. Thank you very much, Charlie.
No, pleasure. And as you probably read this week, Norway's coastline has been extended by 2,000 kilometers or miles.
Yeah.
They remeasured it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie, for joining us.
Pleasure.